Okay, I'm back at the whiteboard, and the GSP shirt has made it through the wash, so we can continue. I've been promising a ignition timing video for a long time now, and I'm really excited to actually put this together. I have pre-drawn my graphs so that I could get the scaling just right and hopefully convey this information the best I can, and I don't want to walk in front of the camera. So we got 3 graphs going on here, actually 4 if you include the black line. And I'm just going to start from the top. And the first thing that you've got to understand with ignition timing is whether or not your engine is octane limited or not. And a lot of people like to use the word knock limited, and I prefer octane limited, thanks to a good buddy of mine that gave me an education on this. But the reason that I say that is because if you increase the octane content, it's going to increase your knock limit. And so really what it comes down to whenever we have that situation is an inadequate fuel. I'm going to just go through these 3 cylinder pressure graphs to start with and kind of explain how ignition timing has an effect on each of them. And hopefully this will kind of make sense here really fast. So let's say this black line right here is our cranking cylinder pressure. So this is effectively the cylinder pressure that we achieve whenever we're just going to crank the engine over with the starter, and we're not going to have any kind of ignition event whatsoever, and we are going to close the intake valve down here, and we're going to bring the piston up, and it's going to compress the air in the cylinder up to the point where it reaches the smallest volume, which is top dead center, and then it's going to travel right back down until our exhaust valve opens somewhere over here and lets all that pressure out. I have laid this out to have some rough scaling. This is not going to be all-encompassing for when every one of these events happens, and I intentionally did not put a y-axis on this graph because I didn't want to quote you some cylinder pressure number that's going to be completely different for so many different applications and different fuels, different timing amounts. All that stuff is kind of irrelevant. We're looking at the relative changes here, and where your exhaust valve opening occurs is going to be dictated by the camshaft, obviously. So this is just a random place that I chose over here in the rough region where we would want to try to make that event happen. So where we really need to focus at this point is I want you to notice where peak cylinder pressure occurs in every one of these instances. So if we start with the green graph here, this guy right there, that's our naturally aspirated pressure with optimized timing. And so this is a very common scenario where I should go ahead and add that this black dotted line across the top is our knock limit. So that's going to be our octane limit with whatever fuel it is we're running right now. And a lot of times your naturally aspirated situations, your 9.5 to 1, 10.5 to 1, somewhere in there, stock engines, are not actually going to reach a knock limited value. You're never actually going to get there even with optimized ignition timing. And this is fairly common for most NA engines, street engines, until you cross that threshold of roughly 11.5, 12 to 1, and we can bump that up a little bit with direct injection, and that's a completely different video, so we're not going to get there. But ultimately, we never actually get there before we optimize timing, and the reason that is, I want to explain this, is anytime you have work going on, let me grab my green marker here, in this region, when the piston is still on the way up, that's negative work. That means that you're trying to actually push the piston down with cylinder pressure, and it wants to slow the engine rotation down, and therefore you're making negative work on the piston, means negative torque effectively on your crankshaft, and that's not a good thing, right? Well, it's kind of a necessary evil to some extent, because we can't light the entire charge at once like you would want to. The optimal timing, the optimal pressure curve rather, would be to have no cylinder pressure until after the piston reaches the top, and then we're going to light the entire charge instantaneously, create all the cylinder pressure we can to shove the piston back down, and get completely positive work. And that's not realistic. It doesn't actually happen that way. The flame front travel time is pretty significant in terms of crankshaft degrees. I mean, we're looking at, and that's effectively what ignition timing is. I want to point that out. We're looking at starting the spark, somewhere right here, in order to achieve this optimal cylinder pressure curve. And where the optimal cylinder pressure curve is whenever the work on this side of top dead center is maximized. That's the definition of optimal ignition timing, is whenever your positive work minus your negative work reaches the highest value. So this particular case is pretty representative of what you would see in order to achieve that optimal ignition timing, and you're going to have to give something up to get the majority of it out. Now, what happens whenever we throw a situation in where we're now octane limited? A situation like, say, that same 10.5 to 1 engine that now we're cramming 20 pounds of boost down its throat. That now changes the scenario. And the reason that we retard timing with boost is not the same reason we retard timing with nitrous. They're related, but the main point, the reason that you retard your timing with boost is because we're trying to allow the piston to reach top dead center and start down again before we reach this peak cylinder pressure that is going to ultimately create knock. And I'm going to add something to this red graph shortly that will kind of explain some things, but the point here, if you look at the shape of this curve, is that we're going to start the spark later. We're going to start it right in here around 15 degrees, 14, 15 degrees. And if we start the spark later, what actually happens is it pushes peak cylinder pressure later, and it also will cause peak cylinder pressure to that curve to be flatter, where right now when we get to this region, the piston has already started its way down. So as the flame front is still traversing and causing an increase in pressure, the piston is on its way down, which is causing an increase in volume, and therefore we don't ever see that huge pressure spike. It's kind of a balancing act of making sure we don't get above that knock threshold that causes that detrimental knock to, takes out your pistons and lifts ring lands, and all sorts of horrible things happen. So the point of this, and I drew pictures down here to kind of illustrate where the piston is at in these relative situations, is to have this graph, this blue graph. We're going to delay the timing so that we never actually reach this knock limit. That's the whole point of it. Now let's talk about what happens if we were not going to retard the timing. And obviously we know that this is bad, and this is how rod bearings get spit out, and how crankshafts end up on the ground, and how pistons turn to dust. Why does that happen? It's really important to understand, right? So we don't run into that situation. Well, what happens is if you start this too soon, the cylinder pressure increases because we've forced so much air into the cylinder that as we burn that amount of air with that amount of fuel, the pressure increases. It's an exothermic reaction that causes that. And so whenever we reach this point right here, where we've reached this threshold, that's where the engine's going to knock. And I drew a curve as if it did not knock. And I did that intentionally because what I want you to see is the definition of knock, whatever you want to call it, detonation. There's many different terms for it. Not the same thing as pre-ignition. Let me point that out. But detonation / knock occurs whenever the entire charge reaches a pressure and temperature that it all ignites at the same time. It's like a bomb going off. It's whenever you are slowly traversing the flame front across your piston and your combustion chamber the way you should, and then all of a sudden you have reached that critical moment where all of it combusts at the same time. And what that looks like is this. We'll be cruising up, and the moment you hit that spot, cylinder pressure goes through the roof. It's off the charts. And it will be this nasty, horrible sounding thing that will just literally beat the pistons out of your engine, because it's like setting a bomb off, and there's nowhere for that pressure to go. The other thing that happens, and this is what happens whenever you have, I'm sure we've probably all heard of chamber softening, and if you haven't, I'll explain that in just a second. But if you have hot spots, this happens in some cases. One of the reasons why you can lift a ringland is it happens behind the ring. Most of the time when you lift a ringland in a stock application, it's because the rings were not gapped and they generated so much heat that they actually end up touching together. And when they touch together, they have to bow up. They have to go down or they have to go up. And what that does is it creates an axial force on that ringland that ends up popping it off. But you can erode that. You can actually literally melt it as if you were welding. You can create so much localized heat due to this abnormal combustion that happens in these small places that it can erode that and eventually lead to a ringland failure. And chamber softening is something that is done to your combustion chambers to make them extremely smooth and to get rid of those peaks and sharp edges that would ultimately become very hot in a really high temperature application, like say big nitrous, big turbo applications, that would ultimately act like a spark plug. It could eventually become hot enough that it could create an auto ignition scenario. So I'm gonna wrap it back up here to ignition timing, and I wanna just hit the highlights one more time. I'm trying to make these videos short and sweet and to the point, and so we can understand what it is without having to spend all night doing it. But ultimately what we're talking about here is finding the correct timing, whether that's on the dyno, whether that's using cylinder pressure sensors, whatever you've got to do, I don't care how you do it, is finding the correct timing safely that nets us the most work on the piston as it's going down with the least amount of work on the piston when it's coming up. That averages out, whatever that peak timing is, you're going to find yourself making the most power in that spot. One thing that I want to point out is usually your peak cylinder pressure is going to happen somewhere, or just after top dead center. You want it to happen 10-15 degrees. You're going to see this peak is not right at zero. It's kind of in this region right here. And the way you find this number, if you are working off the green curve, we're NA and we are optimizing the timing and we're not octane limited. Now, you're going to just simply take your engine, whether you're on the dyno or on the street. If you're on the street, you got to run the same road at the same spot, going the same direction. It's got to be as repeatable as you can possibly get. And you're going to evaluate the time in that case that it takes to accelerate throughout different regions of the data log that you're taking. And you want to see your RPM rate of change increase or decrease with changes in ignition timing. And the same thing we do on the dyno. Whenever we're running the car, we're going to measure power and say, okay, that made 480 horsepower at 30 degrees of timing. These are random numbers. Do not put 30 degrees of timing in your LS engine. It made 480 horsepower at 30 degrees of timing. Let's put 32 in and see what happens. At 32 degrees of timing, we made 520 horsepower. Holy cow, that's a big gain. Okay, let's put two more in. Let's put 34 degrees in it. 530 horsepower comes out when we put 34 degrees in it. Okay, let's put 36 in it. 527 horsepower comes out when we put 36 in it. Okay, we found the peak, right? 34 degrees of timing made the best power. Well, did it? Because we went 34 and 36. So let's see what 35 is. We run it at 35 degrees of timing and it makes 540 horsepower. I think that was higher. long story short, find your peak timing, find your peak power that you achieve with the correct amount of timing. And in my case, as a tuner, it's not worth that last 5 or 10 horsepower to be on the ragged edge, and I will typically pull 1 degree and ship it. And that's where you're going to make the most reliable horsepower. It's different if we're running a boosted application. When we're running a boosted application and we're octane limited, you can't creep up until it makes the most power, right? Because every time we put a degree in it, we're going to shift this blue curve closer and closer and closer to the red, and eventually it's going to knock. You're always going to end up making some amount more power. The key is finding the spot where it starts to go away. If you are on the dyno and it makes 40 more horsepower when you add a degree, then add another degree. And then it makes another 35 horsepower, add another degree. When you see it start to make like 20 more or 15 more, that's when you go, okay, all right, we're approaching the threshold. Let's stay calm here. Back it down to that last spot where it made 30 more, and that's probably the good safe place to do it. Now I'm just picking random numbers here. If 28 is the same thing as 30, 32 is the same thing as 30, 15 is the same thing as 10. You get my point. It's all relative numbers. You want to be really careful whenever you're doing octane limited things. It will creep up on you in a hurry, and you can take out parts in a hurry if you get too close to this. And the reason that it's so sensitive is because as you move this farther to the left, remember what I said about the piston's on its way down whenever we are kind of halfway through this blue curve here. So as the pressure is rising, the volume is decreasing, which is kind of it equals itself out. Sorry, I said volume decreasing. When volume's increasing, so it's kind of equaling itself out. As you move this graph, it moves very quickly because now we are making more cylinder pressure earlier, and the piston is not traveling down as fast. This is especially exaggerated on engines that have longer rods that have a higher dwell time. At TDC. So I think that's pretty well covers most of it. I'm sure I'm going to get some questions for this, and I'm really excited to answer those because I absolutely love questions, especially when you guys hit me with the good ones and make me think. So that's going to be the quick and dirty ignition timing. And next thing I want to do is probably try to do a fuel video and explain what octane is, why we rate it the way we rate it. Explain what stoichiometric air fuel ratio is, explain why we make peak power at richer values, and explain why we have to run so much fuel whenever we're talking about boosted and nitrous applications. So there's your little teaser for the next one, and until then, GSP out. I will see you guys soon.